So we're just getting started here. Just a reminder, as much as possible, to be present. It makes a difference. Letting go of the distractions on your computer and your space as much as possible to be present. It makes a difference for our speakers and presenters. In this strange way across Zoom, we can actually feel it when people are more present. So try as much as possible to be present and let go of any distractions that might be going on for you. A reminder about the chat that we're going to use the chat primarily for questions to when we get to a question and answer part of the session, as well as for clarifying questions, but not to have a separate conversation while the presentation is going on. And just a reminder, Ethelbert, we have a big group here, and it's a diverse in terms of Hebrew College group, which is to say that it's primarily rabbinical and cantorial students who are going to be here, but there are some faculty who teach in both those programs and in other programs at Hebrew College. We have some education students who might be joining us, students who are getting a master's in education, and some staff at Hebrew College, as well as potentially some alumni, so some graduates who are either rabbis, cantors, or educators, or all of those things. So we have, for us, a diverse group. And we're just excited for the opportunity to be together and learn with you.
So thank you for the invitation.
Yeah. I'm going to spotlight you guys, and Rafi, do you want to take it away? Thank you so much, by the way, Rafi Ellington. He'll explain a little bit more why he's doing this. But Rafi, thank you so much for all the work you've put into making this session possible. Really, just making the session possible. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having Ethelbert and myself for this. So yeah, it is. Some of you may have read Ethelbert before, some of you may have not, but Ethelbert is really a luminary poet and writer and literary activist who I was introduced to by my translation teacher, Joanna Chen, last year while I can't remember what, but I remember we were sitting in a bakery on Kakal Street in Rechavia in Jerusalem, and she said, have you ever thought about translating from English to Hebrew instead of Hebrew to English? And I said, okay, I can give it a shot. And she said, yeah, there's this poet, Ethelbert Miller, that wants his poems translated into Hebrew. And I was like, oh, wow, how fascinating, like a Black Jew to translate his work into Hebrew with a white Jew to, no, he's not Jewish. He just wants to translate his work into Hebrew. And that began a fascinating journey that we'll talk about a little bit more later. But really our work together has been really transformative. I've learned a great deal just about what it means to be in dialogue with people, with Ethelbert, and it's made me a better translator and a better person, and I hope ultimately a better rabbi. In this particular session, I'm hoping that we can explore some of the questions that Ethelbert and I talk about quite regularly and that have been features of Ethelbert's career for 40-some, 50-some years even. What is literary activism? How does that relate to pluralistic activism? How does it relate to multiracial activism? We'll talk about our project of translating 50 haikus into Hebrew. Joanna Chen is her name. We're going to talk about Ethelbert's background, the work he does, and we'll talk about his activism as it pertains to reaching out to the Jewish community in DC, work that he's long been engaged in. In terms of structure, we're going to start with Ethelbert, after a brief prompt by me, reading expository writing, prose, and poetry. Will be punctuated by some periodic questions that I'm going to ask him. Then we'll move into a more interactive section where we'll explore the haiku that was written I think you wrote the haiku mostly all of last year in response all last year in response to the pandemic, the Black Lives Matter protests. And we'll discuss both the content of the poems as well as the process of the translation of it. And both between haikus as well as after we finish, we're going to welcome questions. So I'm going to read the bio that Ethelbert provided for us, and then we'll get started with the program. E. Ethelbert Miller is a writer and literary activist. He is the author of 2 memoirs and several books of poetry, including the collected poems of E. Ethelbert Miller, a comprehensive collection that represents over 40 years of his work. For 17 years, Miller served as the editor of Poet Lore, the oldest poetry magazine published in the United States. His poetry has been translated into nearly a dozen languages. Miller is a two-time Fulbright Senior Specialist Program Fellow to Israel. He holds an honorary degree of Doctor of Literature from Emory and Henry College and has taught at several universities. Miller is the host of the weekly WPFW morning radio show On the Margin with E. Ethelbert Miller, and host and producer of The Scholars on UDC TV, which received a 2020 Telly Award. In recent years, Miller has been inducted into the 2015 Washington, D.C. Hall of Fame and awarded the 2016 AWP George Garrett Award for Outstanding Community Service in Literature and the 2016 D.C. Mayor's Art Award for Distinguished Honor. In 2018, he was inducted into Gamma Chi Phi and appointed as an ambassador for the Authors Guild. Most recently, Miller was given a grant by the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities and a congressional award in recognition of his literary activism. He served on the board of the DC Collaborative for Humanities and Education and the Inner Loop. Miller's latest book, If God Invented Baseball, published by City Point Press, was awarded the 2019 Literary Award for Poetry by the Black Caucus of the American Library Association. Hello, Ethelbert.
Okay, thank you, Rafi.
Yeah.
You know, in keeping with the whole thing of being a literary activist, what I spent, earlier today doing was doing a radio interview in which we were discussing Amanda Gorman's poem during the inauguration. And so what I was doing was trying to put that poem in the context of other poems by people invited to read at the inauguration, from people like Robert Frost at Kennedy's inauguration, to people that we forget, in terms of other writers who were there giving a poem. And that's the thing I was trying to fill in, that little gap. And I won't even tell you who the poet is, so you can guess. It's not Maya Angelou, it's not Elizabeth Alexander, it's not Richard Blanco, but there's another guy who's stuck in there, that I think it's very important to go back and look at. And then I was talking about how challenging it is to write a poem, upon request. I've only done that once in my life. And that's a poem that I shared with Rafi about Oscar Romero, where someone asked me, we're having this program for Oscar Romero, could you write a poem? So, when you're looking at being a literary activist, you try to provide some clarity to current events. You try to put things in certain contexts, and that demands a certain understanding, a certain amount of research that goes in it. You're not just speaking off the top of your head. And so I try to offer that to the literary community. And because of where I am in my career right now, a lot of people, including my daughter-in-law, what do you think of the poem? So you better have an opinion, And so I try to make sure that I stay on top of things. I stay abreast of current events, and I'm always looking for connections. And so that ties in with my joy in terms of collaborating with Rafi, in terms of, I think as an artist, collaboration is how you learn and how you grow. You're never too early to learn. You're never too old to learn, to stop learning. And so, I'm happy that it has led not just to a book project, but to me meeting you. And if anything that I have said is encouraging to you on your journey and your path, then I've done my work. I always maintain that if you want to stay in contact with me, my email address is readily accessible. If we're actually meeting in an actual auditorium, I'll be handing out business cards. But you can also obtain my email. And I say that because sometimes you could say something that somebody takes offense with. And if you are an activist, what you're trying to do is build bridges within a community. And so what happens is that if you say something and someone, doesn't feel like raising their hand in the auditorium, well, maybe 2 or 3 days after, they'll send you an email or something, and you can have a one-on-one conversation. And that's how we use the technology to enhance our sense of community. And so I just wanted to say that. Let me begin the actual formal presentation that Rafi and I outlined. I'm going to read first from the Writer's Chronicle. There's a piece that I wrote from last year about Black Lives Matter. And if the subtitle is, if you don't know me by now, that's a little quiz. You know who's saying that. Okay. And I felt that I had to respond to what was going on. And I wrote the following. I'll just read this excerpt. And this comes near the end of the article. Over the last few years, it appears a new generation discovered the works of James Baldwin. The essence of Baldwin's work always revolved around love and the freedom to love. If we connect his writings to Martin Luther King's Jr. sermons, then the task is to find the strength to love. How often do we need to be reminded that this Black and white affair is a lover's struggle? How do we make this relationship work? Listening to Patti LaBelle singing, "If You Don't Know Me By Now," and you realize that America is at that point where someone has their backs packed. After all the conversations about race, we may never, never, never know each other at all. Is this the price of the ticket or simply the fire next time? This brings us back to that last book by King. Where do we go from here, chaos or community? For King, it has always been the beloved community. His vision of the World House was a place of justice and equal opportunity, a place where one embraced their fellow human being and no one was discriminated against. If we look around and don't see the beloved community, then our work must be to build one and bring it into existence. We must do this without metaphors. We cannot continue to comfort ourselves with storytelling and remembering the past. Our survival is dependent on discovering the shape and forms of things unknown. We must have the faith to love, the faith to give birth to a future bright and spilling glitter into our hands. If there's one thing the Black Lives Matter movement has done, it has forced white people to examine not just their history, but also their myths. As writers, we know how difficult this can be. We know too often the work we do perpetuates certain myths while distorting the truth. Racial identity at times has an adhesive backing, connecting it to myths of superiority. Tear it off too quickly, and blood spills from an open wound. Knocking down Confederate statues will always come with a price if there are no explanations. The Black Lives Matter movement in 2020 has been a wake-up call for America. We either move towards a new reconstruction or we face another civil war. As writers, we will need to define and create beauty, not just for ourselves, but for every living thing that has a desire for air. We cannot tell each other what to write or how to live, but we must show one another how to love. I want to call my neighbor beloved. And that's just something I wrote. Rafi, if you want to ask me a question about this, I'll respond.
Yeah, something that I'm curious about. So I've, at this point, read hundreds of your poems, which has been a privilege, by the way. And a piece like this more expository essay writing, it seems to me that you're coming from a conclusion that you're trying to convince an audience of, as opposed to what I read as sort of so crucial to your writing, which is you state sort of, this is my observation of the world around me, and I want you to glean from it. And I'm curious, how are each of those types of literary activism?
Well, I think someone looking back will probably identify me. I don't talk a lot about this, but I probably would be identified as one of the early African-American bloggers, you know? And so what happens is that there are a number of publications that when they were doing online would take something I had blogged in what I call my e-notes and then move it over to their website or their presence on the internet. So you look up the root.com. I didn't even know they were taking stuff that I was writing until my daughter said, "Oh, by the way, Daddy, you know, somebody's using such and such." Ebony Magazine did the same thing. And so when you mention, you know, my writing, you know, that's a blog. And what I did, I moved my blog basically to my Facebook page. So usually what happens in terms of this AWP piece, this was a blog piece that once somebody saw and liked it, said, "Okay, could you expand it?" And then I expanded it into an article. So everything from like the Washingtonian to some of the intellectual journals have taken some of the things I have written or they saw as a blog and asked me to expand on it. So you never know who's reading your work when you put your work up there. And what I monitor are not the likes necessarily on Facebook. I'm looking at the number of shares that so I know that somebody likes it and they want to share it with others. And that means that, you know, I take a certain voice. I try to be a voice in my e-notes in which I'm trying to engage people in what I think is important. Sometimes what happens, I'm always going back to the importance of language. So for example, if someone yells in the street, you know, defund the police, I immediately say that's stupid, you know, and I deal with it in terms of just language. You know, see, I was the type of guy back in the 1960s when they said, free all political prisoners. I said, oh no, man, there are some people who need to be in jail. You know, just like, you know, I go into correctional facilities all the time. And I remember I went into one in Maryland and I had to tell the young men, I said, you see, you guys up here, you know, reading stuff like that. You reading like Malcolm X. You are not Malcolm X. You are Malcolm Little. You're still breaking into people's homes and you haven't got your X yet, okay? Give up your part, don't have sex for 15 years, and then you can come out and be Malcolm X. And I said it in a joking way, because what happens is that I try to sometimes hear a statement, defund the police, free all political prisoners. And we as writers, and this is our contribution as writers, I'm concerned about the words we use. I'm concerned about the narratives that we create. And so I feel I'm not a carpenter, I'm not a doctor, you know, I can't help you with COVID, but I can definitely help you with some language that might be making you sick. And that's what I think is my responsibility as a literary activist.
Well, I definitely want to take that then and invite you to read the excerpt from your memoir, Fathering Words, because I think that really hits on all of the points that you've just brought up in a major way, particularly as it comes to how do we construct our own stories. And I'll let you say more about the piece.
Sure. This is a reprint of the Fathering Words 20th anniversary issue, actually. What happened is I would not have done this book if it hadn't been out of loss. You know, I lost my brother and then my father. But when my brother died, it was everything came out of, you know, the order was gone, because you never expect like your father to bury, you know, child, you know. So it was that case. So I wanted to honor that. When my father died shortly after my brother, I stood on the cemetery in Yonkers. And my father was one of the first, I think, people in my family who decided he wanted to be cremated, which was very, you know, unusual for a West Indian family. Like, what happened? We're not going to the gravesite? No. Oh, he's going to be cremated, right? So when my father's actually buried, many people came to the funeral in Harlem, but they did not have an opportunity the next day to travel up to Yonkers for the actual burial. And I saw my father little box go into the grave. And it's not like you see a coffin, you see a little box. And I looked at that, I said, you know, it's my dad. And I said, you know, I can't accept that this person in my life who's given me my life is reduced down to this little box. And then I decided I could do something that you do with literature. I could take a working class man, immigrant from Panama, I could take his life and I could make it heroic. And that's what I do in the beginning of Fathering Words. Now, let me tell you about my life before I read the excerpt. I don't know about show raise of hands on the screen here, but if you are the baby of the family, okay, how long you come, the babies, right? I thought for many years, my man, shh, because when your parents see you like at the door, like listening, like, so you grow up not knowing anything. You don't even know if you were adopted, you know, shh, right? So what happened, here I am, I decided I'm going to write a memoir, and I immediately realized, who are these people? I don't know who they are. And they tell, I hear stories like, yes, before you were born, we had a rooster. What? In the Bronx? Yeah, we had the rooster on the fire escape. What kind of family am I born into? They had a rooster and a bunny. No wonder they said, let's have one more child. After the rooster and the bunny comes me, you know? Anyway, I digress, Rafi. But anyway, what happened, because I didn't know any story, I asked my sister, because, and this might be a case you might relate to, in many households, it is the women who begin to know the stories. They may hear the stories when their hair is being braided. They may hear the stories when they're cooking in the kitchen on a holiday. But I've realized that my sister knew more about the family than I did. And so in this book, Fathering Words, It's a duet of voices. I created my sister's voice to go along with mine because my sister knew things I didn't know. And I had to imagine, okay, this is why it's creative nonfiction. I had to imagine. And the biggest test was running it past my sister.
Mm.
And by coincidence, I had the publisher send the manuscript to my sister. I happened to call my sister when she had finished reading the book. And she said, when I called her up, she's living in Yonkers, and she said, oh, I just finished reading the book. I was writing you a note.
Mm.
And I said to her, well, did you like the book? Did you like, waiting. She said, oh, I love this book. I mean, you captured everything I would like to say. I love this book. And one of the things I did, and I'm happy I did, and I would make this reference to all of you listening, I told my sister to continue writing the note as if I had not made the phone call. Because one of the things I discovered within households is that we don't write letters to each other. Okay, you in college, you might ask to write home, send some money or something like that, but you don't really have letters. And I found, like, for example, with my mother and father, I only have a few notes in their handwriting. Okay, so what my sister wound up sending me was probably the only letter my sister had ever sent me, you see? And so what happens is that it was key. And since I was creating her voice, I felt the responsibility to get it right. Now, my sister would tell me after this book comes out, and she's an older woman, older than me at that time, she was dating a younger guy, right? And she didn't want to let the younger guy know how old she was. And so what happened, she would say, oh, my brother's an author, and she gave him a copy of the book to read. Well, then he knows how old she is. And so my sister says to me on the phone, this book is getting her in trouble. I said, well, if you just be truthful to people, you wouldn't have a problem. Anyway, here's the introduction to the book. Chapter 1. The day after my brother died, Carmen, one of his neighbors, said she saw him walking his dog. My brother Richard, who had changed his name to Francis, loved animals, and so he took the name of the saint he loved. Growing up in the South Bronx, it was important to believe in something. And so my brother made the decision to believe in God. I met God one afternoon on Longwood Avenue in the Bronx. It must have been around 1958, and I was attending Pierce 39, which was located near the streets like Beck, Kelly, and Fox. Longwood Avenue was the big street, and I was not permitted to cross it alone. I was in one of those grades in school where you took naps and the teachers gave you cookies when you were good. On the day I met God, I had been standing on the corner for almost an hour, afraid to cross Longwood Avenue. All my school friends were gone, and I was alone with cars passing by and the dark evening creeping in like one of my sister's boyhood lovers. I was afraid to cross the street without holding someone's hand. And so I did something my brother was good at doing. I started praying to God. I asked God to come for me, to help me cross the big street. If he did, I promised I would be good for the rest of my life. I would never steal or lie. I closed my eyes and only opened them when I heard my father running across the street, cursing and trying to fix his clothes at the same time. When I was little, I thought my father was God. Now, many times you have writings, okay, just like musicians, you sample, you bring things into your work that you may not use immediately, but you remember it. Now, many of you celebrate, about Kwanzaa, it's like Hanukkah, the candles, right? You got what happened. It's 1969. I'm at Howard University, and Maulana Ron Karanga, who would create Kwanzaa, he created this thing about myths, that to instill that sort of pride and uplift. And so he was the one that was, and all these leaders, if you might want to go back, they all have high-pitched voices, so they sound like Mike Tyson, okay? So if you ever hear Huey Newton, power to the people, man, they talk like that. I never forgot Ron Karanga because I'm young, and he's giving his speech at Howard University in the gym, and all these Black people are there, and he's telling them what to do. And he's like, yes, you have to understand that you're the Asiatic Black man. Oh, I am? I thought from the Bronx. Anyway, what happened, he instilled this mythology to uplift you. Now, the first person I ever read with was a very important poet by the name of Carolyn Rogers. She is key to what I just read to you. Carolyn Rogers wrote a poem in the 1960s, late 1960s. I never forgot. It was a poem in which she's growing up. She's a young girl and she has a puppy, right? She has a puppy, and what happens is the puppy runs into the street and gets hit by a car and is killed. And the little girl, Carolyn Rogers, holds that puppy, waiting for her father to come home. Why? Because in her home, the father was the fix-it man. And she knew that when her father came home, he would fix the puppy. Now, I look at that and I said, that is phenomenal to give your father that power. And that's where I'm ready to hear that my father had. I tell people, I grew up on those movies like the TV shows like Father Knows Best and all, Leave It to Beaver, stuff like that. That was not my household. Okay, like I tell people, my father was like the Supreme Court. Some cases never got to him. Okay, so what happens is that he comes home from work and Gene, you didn't do your homework. He doesn't. That's the lower court. That's my mother. Okay, the homework. Did you clean up your room? My father didn't even deal with if you got arrested or something like that. Because I remember clearly and this is how times have changed. Today, if your phone rings, okay, at 2 o'clock in the morning, okay, now it's different because it's a cell phone. You knew that 2 o'clock phone be in the other room, that it was either the wrong number or bad news. And I remember clearly, I was a little boy and the phone rang like around 2:30 in the morning. And my mother answered it and she was all upset. And she says to my father, Eddie, I was in jail. And my father said, let him stay there. And he went back to sleep. That ties, go ahead.
Right, I think I just want to interrupt you briefly. I want to just pivot a tiny bit, because I think what you're talking about here in large is, well, what you're showing, I think all of us, is how in your mind you have this archive of memory. Mm-hmm. And what I think, and you briefly alluded to your time at Howard, but truthfully, I was almost surprised to not see it mentioned in your bio, but you worked at Howard for how many years was it?
Over 40.
Over 40 years. You were like the chief archivist at
right.
Howard, in the Howard University Library. And I will say that I was able to speak at your birthday party, your 70th birthday party several weeks ago. And it was amazing to me to see all the people who have been influenced by you. I think I will say it was probably one of the highlights of my year so far, that I got to be on a panel. I got to be in the Zoom room with Ta-Nehisi Coates at the same time. That was definitely a big moment. But I was wondering if you could speak to this love of narrative that you're talking about and connect it to your archival work. And again, how that all binds with literary activism, how the act of memory is literary activism.
Well, you're very perceptive, Rafi. You notice that there's no reference to Howard University in my bio. Okay, that's because I was dismissed from Howard University. And you go online, there's a lot of news coverage of my dismissal. It was upsetting to people, but I find it was very liberating. But what happens right there, you can see, everyone has to be concerned about the narrative that they're creating. And what I felt as an archivist and a literary activist, I saw so many writers, who would depart, some by accident, some, age. And it's very sad when you saw that some people were just not remembered. And I was trying to save everything about a particular writer that, so that memory would be there. And I also was thinking about providing resources for future scholars. That was the key thing. Who's going to be studied 40 or 50 years from now. And that was an outgrowth for being a student at Howard University and opening a book and looking about, look at the period of the 1920s, the Harlem Renaissance. And I would say, you mean the only people writing in the country, Black people writing in the country, was Langston Hughes, County Cullen, Claude McKay. There must be some other people. And I realized, what happened, I being a literary activist, I'm also studying and learning literary politics. Okay, so if somebody wanted to ask me any question today about how did somebody get to be well known, I can let you know that, because I was documenting that. And sometimes what happens is that I'm very close to people who are doing scholarship on African American literature, and I help them flesh things out. Just this week, for example, I interviewed Hillary Holiday, who just did a recent biography on Adrienne Rich, which is very good. Now, in that book, she's talking about Adrienne Rich's relationship with Audre Lorde, June Jordan, and I told her, and this is a major biography on Adrienne Rich. I told Hillary Holiday, well, I have an unpublished interview with Audre Lorde. Okay, people know that, you know, June Jordan was a major person in my life, and that even her poem, like Poem About My Rights, which is a key poem, you know, I edited that poem. We went back and forth. That information has to get to future scholars. I'm just using that as an example. And so I'm making sure that if you're going to create a narrative, that you know exactly what you're building it on.
So something that I'm curious about that, and then I'd love to then transition to you reading some of the poems that you've also brought. I'm very curious what you say to this audience of clergy students and some faculty and educators as well. How you then take those values that you carry with you into your activism, and how can we then perhaps carry that into our practice as cantors and as rabbis and as educators, et cetera, et cetera? How do you see religious leaders being able to take on those types of roles?
Well, I tell you what you should do. It's something I'm working right now with her, and so I see her quite frequently. But I remember clearly when Adrian Fenty became mayor of Washington, D.C., and the outgoing mayor, Sharon Pratt, wrote a piece in the Washington Post of advice to the incoming Mayor Fenty. And that would be something that I would mention to everyone who's listening to me today. Sharon Pratt said, it's very important to, you know, be aware of the people who are not in the room. Okay. So if you are a member of a religious community, and I put an emphasis on interfaith work, you have to make sure that your vision of your community is able to embrace people who are on the opposite side of you. They have to be there to have that sort of dialogue. And that means that you have to learn how to listen. And that is very important in terms of you know, providing comfort, counseling, whatever. And it also shows that you have to make sure that you're listening, not necessarily with your head, but listening with your heart. Okay. And that's something that where you get into the word of compassion. Okay. Compassion, you know, and showing that having that sense of compassion is different from being a witness. Okay. Witness is simply of being like an observer or whatever. But when you're compassionate about something, it means that you understand, you identify, and you take that in. And now you're willing to respond. And so I think that everybody who's like right now, you are on a journey. Okay, you're on a journey. You may not realize how to pastor or shelter or whatever, provide guidance to a community until years later. Okay, things are going to happen on your journey to provide you with wisdom and a direction. Now, what the Hebrew College hopefully will give you is something that Columbus didn't have, a decent map that works. you know, so you should be left with something that you don't say, oh, these are Indians? No, they're not Indians. Okay, you know, so you leave your school if your teachers have taught you well. Even if they don't know what's out there, they tell you there's going to be things on your journey that you're going to have to experience. I can't tell you as a teacher how to respond because I don't know fully what's out there. But I tell you this, I give you these provisions, I give you this way that if your little blueprints don't work, then you're going to have to do what Nat Turner did. Read the stars in the sky to at least guide you in the direction that you need to go. Okay? And everyone's on a journey. And everyone is going to be at different points in their journey. And that's why sometimes it'll take somebody 10 or 15 years to say, oh, you know, I really wanted to, you know, not ride that bus or get off that bus with Rosa Parks, but, you know, I wasn't ready. Yeah. And King is a perfect example. King was not ready to lead the Montgomery bus boycott. Okay. He was not ready. Okay. And E.D. Nixon, who was organizing, called him up. And King said, I got a new family. I'm not ready. And he said, well, call me back later on. And E.D. Nixon called him back later on. And King reluctantly said, okay, I'm in. And E.D. Nixon said, that's good, because the meeting's in your church. You see, that the community realized more than he did the potential. Okay.
Yeah, I think a lot of part of what you're saying is that sometimes the movements that are happening around us, sometimes the external to the internal is just as powerful as the internal to the external. And I actually think that that's a great way to transition to the three poems you prepped for us. I'd love, you just want to sort of read them in a row if there's.
Okay, I'll read them in a row. And I'll begin with this one, a cold and trembling thing, because that ties into what you're leading me to discuss, and that's the activism. If you look at African American poetry, you can tell the activism based on certain names that continue to pop up. So for example, if I go back to the Black Arts Movement, you're gonna see a lot of references to Malcolm X. You're gonna see a lot of references to John Coltrane. When King is assassinated, you'll see a lot. This poem that I'm gonna read is a 1990s poem, and immediately you see that my activism involves, dealing with apartheid in South Africa. So if I go back and look at many of my friends, they have a Nelson Mandela or Winnie Mandela poem. A cold and trembling thing. It is the darkness of my cell at night that finds me clinging to a sip of prayer and a crumb of hope. What if I opened my eyes after 27 years only to discover I could no longer cry? What then? There are laws that must be broken like stones. I am Mandela, a prisoner on an island. Why is freedom sometimes a cold and trembling thing? So that's the poem. And then I'll read this second poem. And this is, I like this poem. It's very short. I wrote very short poems when I started out back in 1968. And I could read all my poems in about 15, 20 minutes. Morning. You rise thinking it's just another day. But the first African is being captured down near the shore. It's going to be a long history. That's when you start thinking like, wow, this is happening here. And I tell you, this is nuts. This is it's not funny, really. But I have a friend, Tasha. I met Tasha when I taught at UNLV. And Tasha lives in a little corner of Texas raising horses, and she's in there with it's Trump country, and people are not nice to her. They're calling her a Mexican and go back to where you're from. And she keeps saying, but I'm Puerto Rican. But anyway, she texts me and she says, Ethelbert, they say that Trump's won the election. Is that true? You talk about let the courts proceed. She's still wrestling with it. And I thought about, so you're in Africa and you don't know what's going on down by the coast. You go out, to hang out at Starbucks, and the other people at the coast are being transported through the Middle Passage at the same time. And that's something, when I started writing poems about Nelson Mandela, it was hard for me to say, here I am in DC. If I went over to South Africa, my whole condition changed. Like gravity doesn't work anymore. And so that's what this poem gets at. And this last poem, I said, comes full circle and is a good lead into me and Rafi's work into the Little Book of E, because it's a poem of communion and sharing, bold. And then mindfulness enters the mind. And for a moment, nothing matters except the cutting. I prepare a salad for dinner, a simple meal, food fitting into one bowl, leaves of lettuce, red peppers, yellow peppers, onion, avocado, tomato, basil, oregano, black pepper, Italian dressing. A short prayer, and then the movement of fork to mouth, the chewing and the taste of goodness. Then the small act of giving thanks to the bowl for sharing. Now, what do you notice in that poem? no strawberries. Just joking.
I mean, I think I want to, wow, I mean, that last poem I really particularly love, and also partially because I think it gets at something that is so key, I think, to your style of writing, which is so meditative and measured in taking the hyper specific and blowing it up in both dangerous and safe ways. And so I want to, with that spirit, and also with in mind of something you said of, it's like gravity doesn't work over there, which I thought was a great line that I'm writing down, and I'll email it to you later. I want to bring up an anecdote that you told me once. And I'm going to ask if you could talk about your experience writing poetry about South America at the beginning of your career, and what that was like to share with Black communities.
Oh, you're right. You know, my activism really increased after I left Howard University. I was a student activist, you know, at Howard, and you know, some of the issues was like co-visitation, developing African American Studies program. But I didn't really become the activist until I moved off into the city and began to meet people from Central and South America. That's when I think began to change, where I began to meet people who were battling, you know, Pinochet in Chile, when I was beginning to meet people from Nicaragua, when they were fighting against Somoza. And what happened, there would be meetings in my neighborhood at the church. And because people knew me as a poet, they invited me to, you know, read at some of the cultural programs. And I would be the poet, and then some people would be like, you know, free Nicaragua, you know, the same. So it was a combination of that. Sometimes I would be the only African American, you know, at the meeting or program, and that's where I began to meet a lot of friends. Some friends began to translate my work into Spanish, and so that was a friendship. And then also because of that, I received an invitation to go down to like Nicaragua, and that's when all the people, you realize what a revolution is. You know, somebody who's pumping gas on Columbia Road in Washington, D.C. is now the minister or whatever in Nicaragua after the revolution. And so you learn that. But I also began to expand. And what I like to say is that at Howard, I learned about Langston Hughes. When I got into the community, I learned about Pablo Neruda, okay? But because my work and audience was changing, I was writing more and more about, you know, Central America, the same way, you know, I read a poem sort of in the persona, in the voice of Nelson Mandela. I was writing poems in the voices of other people, you know, especially coming from Central and South America. And after a while, that was the body of my work. And I remember, you know, being invited to a reading that was at a Black church in DC. And I must have read into like my third or fourth poem. And you can see like the fans weren't going like this, you know, they're like, who's this guy? And after a while, I had to like take my little poems and find something with Jesus in it, you know, because you want to communicate. And I realized I had reached a point that my work was leading me in a different direction. And that what happened, I always had to make sure I came back to my roots. I always had to water my roots. And so that was one of the things about activism. You know, you can do out there and show solidarity with the people in Poland or something like that, but you better come back at times to make sure that you're addressing the fact that, you know, people are dealing with their school board or something like that locally, and that you're just not getting, you know, pulled away from where you started.
I think that conversation about how do you communicate messages that are not quote unquote native to a particular community is the exact way that we have framed a lot of our conversation around the Haiku Project. And I think it might make sense for us to read a few of those and welcome.
But first, Rafi, a commercial.
A commercial.
So people will know. Please. This is the Little Book of E.
Yeah, this is actually
this is a little book.
The book that we're translating.
And it's on sale for $14.95. Just joking.
It will be. The book is called The Little Book of E. That is actually the Little Book of E that Ethelbert's been writing from. Hapinkas Hakatan Shel E is what it's called in. Actually, I can't remember if we did Pinkas or Machberet. I'll look back on the notes. But yeah, it'll be. That's what the book. That's where the book came from.
Right. And
so I think what might make the most sense to do is we're going to read I first think Ethelbert should maybe give his preface for how this project began and how he started doing this. Ethelbert will read the English. He'll discuss briefly. I'll read the Hebrew. I'll talk about the choices I made in the process of translation, and we'll go from there, I think.
Okay, I mean, this is a project that if we didn't have a pandemic, I probably would not have worked on it, because I was, like many of you, confined. I began to sit in my backyard, which I had been making into this sort of like little Zen area. So I had a little Zen pad, I had a little Buddha back there, and so I began to be very reflective. I also began to think about my brother who had gone into the monastery and become a Trappist monk. So I was realizing, okay, I can deal with this. And because I'm sitting in my backyard, I'm in a more meditative situation. I'm looking at all the different birds, so it works out well in terms of haiku and nature. And so all of a sudden, that's what was happening. And I was pushing myself to write 1 or 2 haiku a day. So Robbie and I are working on 50 in this little book. There's probably 138. So that gives you the sense of the scope. I think, if Robbie, did you put in the chat book the 3 books?
Yeah, I can put that into.
Okay, yeah, and in the chat book, there are a number of things that, one, I was reading a lot of Thomas Merton. That was important to my brother and also to me. And actually, Joanna was the one who gave me that book by Thomas Merton. So there's a connection between that book and Rafi. And
Joanna is my translation tutor who connected me in Ethelbert.
Right. So, in that you'll see there's 2 books. One name that pops up in both of them is the poet Leonard Moore. And I think Rafi and I have been in touch with Leonard. Leonard Moore is like the expert African-American on haiku. He's been heading up a lot of the haiku international societies. And he's been I've known him for many, many years. And he's been very generous with his time. And he went over and reviewed every single haiku. Now, what happens immediately when I sent them with haiku look, he said, "Oh, Ethelbert, man, this is a 575, man. Nobody does that anymore." He's like, and we're moving on to like, abstract expressionism, Ornette Coleman, we're into that, And what happens is that I said, no, I wanted to make it traditional, especially as in the terms of this translation project, because I felt if we got away from the English traditional structure, then Rafi, when he's doing the translation, like John Coltrane, he can go out on the solo. Okay, he's not going to be limited how I'm limiting myself. But as you can see, I want to at least begin with the sheet music, okay, before you go off. And so that was the thing. I'll read you these 3. I'll read them one behind the other, Rafi, okay?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. This is number 1. And each of them have numbers, and they were written in the order that I wrote them. As Rafi and I work on a book, what we did, thanks to Rafi, is that we rearranged the poems in terms of how they might read better, but we kept the numbers, okay? And that was something where I didn't want to renumber the poems, because some had been published already before, this book has come out. So I'll just read these 3. Number 1, oh, water Sundays, our spirits need to be washed. Let us learn to walk. I'll read that one at a time. So I'll read both of them. Every time I read haiku, I'll read it twice, just for listening. Oh, water Sundays, our spirits need to be washed. Let us learn to walk. This is 65. The hunting season, Black men running in circles, looking for their wings. The hunting season, Black men running in circles, looking for their wings. And this is number 60.
38.
Oh, this is, number, you know what? Right, number 38. The last days of spring, the sun will soon burn our flesh, the joy of blackness. The last days of spring, the sun will soon burn our flesh, the joy of blackness. And those are 3 poems that Rafi has been kind enough to translate for me.
Yeah, I mean, and the process of translation has been very challenging. I mean, for one, I've never translated seriously from English into Hebrew before, and so I really appreciate Ethelbert's trust in me. I passed a 10 haiku test before he put me onto the job, but and those haikus, I will say, were a very different character than these three in particular. They were beautiful, but they were much more focused in the nature world, the natural world, which is where haiku traditionally live. And the other thing that I'll say in general, there's a rule of thumb when you're translating from English to Hebrew, from Hebrew to English rather, that any line or any sentence or whatever will be 1 1/3 times as long. From Hebrew to English, that's true. But in haiku, the way that syllables and the way that sentences and words are constructed in Hebrew, it meant that I oftentimes, if not for basically every haiku, I had to compromise on at least one part of an image in a more serious way if I wanted to retain at least somewhat of an integrity even within the solo. These examples here are less so, but there's more examples of that. And that was part of also the negotiations and the discussion that Ethelbert and I have had over the course of this project, which I guess I'll just say a little bit for me why it was so important, which at first it did begin in a sense of sort of a novelty and a curiosity. But I think that as Ethelbert and I kept talking and we developed more of a deeper relationship through this project, and as the last summer with all of Black Lives Matter protests developed, it became this hope that I have that this book that has these beautiful poems, these beautiful haiku by a Black American poet, that the mere presence of Hebrew on the side will cause Jewish Americans, specifically white Jewish Americans, that it will cause people like me to just take a second look. Because I know that I'll take a second look at a book that has Hebrew. I happen to understand and speak and write Hebrew. I know not everyone else does, but I do really believe that the presence of Hebrew adds both a semantic and an aesthetically meaningful level of kedusha, of holiness. And that was definitely has been in mind while I've been doing this project. So I'll read the ones that Ethelbert. Ethelbert, would you mind just reading them in English and then I can read it in Hebrew?
Okay. Oh, water Sundays, our spirits need to be washed. Let us learn to walk.
May yemei rishon, neshamot zkukot litvila, nilmad lifsoa.
The hunting season, Black men running in circles, looking for their wings.
Onat hatzayid, gvarim shchorim belula'a, mechapsim knafam. So something that I want to bring up here is the word lula'a, which is not circles. Lula'a is it's two things. It's both a course, sort of almost like an infinity sign, you could say, or a course on a track and field place. It's also a noose. So this was a moment where, and I remember a conversation that Ethelbert and I had, where I said, I'm not doing what you're writing here, but I'm adding a separate layer of meaning, which it is a very different layer of meaning in many ways, but Ethelbert gave the sign off to it. And I do really believe that it adds to the overall sense of this poem, and particularly where it lays in the collection.
And I think it also lends itself to that first line.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, I'll read the third one. The last days of spring, the sun will soon burn our flesh, the joy of blackness.
Sof yemei ha'aviv, hashemesh tisrof b'sarenu, hana'at hakadrut. This has been my favorite poem to translate so far, because the word blackness, there have been a lot of concepts that Ethelbert and I have tried to render into Hebrew that are not necessarily there in the same way. There is a word shchorut that has some political impact, but it didn't feel exactly right. Yes, kanfehem is, yes, that is correct. And I can talk about the choices that I made if people have more specific questions afterwards. But it was intentional, yes. We can talk attentively afterwards. And
I should say that poem, you know, that poem begins in me being in Yemen.
Yeah.
And I was in a restaurant. It was hot out. Yemen is hot. But, and what happened, this waiter was waiting on me. There's nobody else. He's just waiting on me. So he sits down. He said, I got to come out here, man, in the sun. And I'm look at me. I'm turning black. I mean, I can't have this. And I'm out here saying, yeah, man, you're going to be like me. I'm having a good time. You know, but it was a whole thing of how, and on serious note, even within the Black community, how Blackness can be seen as negative or positive. So what happens is, in terms of this poem, I try to make the issue of race and color celebratory, but that's not necessarily the case.
Exactly. And so what I loved about this word, for those, the shoresh kuf daled resh is probably now my most like favorite like root word in all of Hebrew. It can go to anything from pottery is a meaning you can derive from there. And then the two that are most relevant for this is that kudar and sort of along those lines of other things means sort of a darkening. So like if the sun is coming down, it can also mean colloquially a certain sadness.
Could it be like eclipse?
It can be not eclipse exactly. I wouldn't say that, but it just means like if the sky darkens and like the moon comes out. But what I liked about it is that you have this sense of sadness with the word, but what you really have, at least in my association, is shchora ani v'nava bnot Yerushalayim ke'ohele kedar. I am black, but I am beautiful, daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar. Now, Harvey Bach, yes, deepening, yes. Thank you, Rachel, thank you. It might, I don't know if Kedar is actually related. I do know that it is the same shoresh, it is the same root, and I just thought it was too perfect. I have a hard time imagining it's not related in some way because of the way that we understand that nation, but that's another story. But this has been sort of the fun, not game of it, this has been the powerful and meaningful and impactful work of rendering Ethelbert's words into Hebrew. And this project of I've spoken Hebrew since I was very, very young, but I'm not a native speaker. It's been quite inspiring, I think, for me to be able to have this opportunity with Ethelbert. I don't know if you have any other comments that you would like to make here.
No, I just want to, publicly thank you, Rafi. We haven't actually physically met, but I think that our opportunities to immediately bond was very good, because with all collaborations, you want to be, it's something more than the work that you do. It's sort of a meeting of the souls and spirit, and that's what I feel is very important. And also, it's always should be and has been a learning experience. So I want to thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I would say all the same. It's been all of that and more for me as well. I want to invite people to ask questions about any part of the presentation that we've had so far, more questions about literary activism, questions about the Haiku Project, etc. Ethelbert, I also will say, just has a ton of phenomenal stories, but I'm not here for that necessarily, but he does. Yeah, let's put in the chat, just I think it might be easier for me. Okay, so let's do two questions at once. So let's hear from Aaron first and then from Abby.
Hi, Ethelbert. Thank you so much for speaking to us today and for sharing. Rafi, also thank you to you too. hearing some of your poems and also reading some of them before this presentation, I noticed particularly with some of the justice figures you're talking about, Mandela, Malcolm X, you read the poems from the first person. I'm curious if there, just how that, how getting into what you imagine their experiences relates to your understanding of their struggles and justice, and what that writing process is like.
That's a good question, and it has a lot to do many times.
I just want to get two questions
Okay.
at once, and then we can, Abby, please.
Hi, Ethelbert. Thank you so much for being here today. My question is about how, for you as a literary activist, why is writing or art on a bigger scale the most effective way for you to make activism happen?
Okay, I'll begin with the second question first. I think that the writing and art creating, it might only be 30% of my time. You know, I don't normally talk openly about what I'm doing, but for many years, I was heading up a think tank. You know, I mean, that's why, you know,
We talk about that.
think tank. You know, which I take. Very important, and it was one of the major think tanks, Institute for Policy Studies, which was founded by Dick Barnett and Mark Raskin. And when you see Jamie Raskin on TV with the impeachment, well, that's Mark Raskin's son. And that's why during my birthday celebration, you know, Jamie Fontaine didn't wish me happy birthday and that. But what happens is that I spent a lot of time working with reporters. I was talking earlier about narrative. A lot of reporters, you know, get ideas, you know, we bounce the ideas off. I've mentored a lot of reporters, and sometimes they come back to me and ask about, you know, what kind of questions should I ask, or this or that. To give me an example, there's one movie that's just out, One Night in Miami, you know, and that's by Kim Powers, you know, who is a person that used to sit by my desk wanting to do comic books and stuff. I say that in terms of my activism might be difficult to measure, because over the years I've mentored a lot of people, and I mentored a lot of people not just in the U.S. I've mentored people across the country. There have been people who have come out of prison. You know, one person who's very prominent right now is Dwayne Betts, and I published Dwayne Betts when he was in jail. You know, and I remember when I was laid off from Howard University, and this is where writing comes in. People were responding, and I happened to be in touch with Dwayne Betts. I said, Dwayne, would you, want to write a letter in support of my behalf? He said, Ethelbert, you don't have to ask. You don't have to ask, because you have meant this much to me when I was incarcerated, and so you look up, you create these sort of relationships which are dealing with your activism. Sometimes I'm in touch with somebody, who's in like Montana or something like that, dealing with, the drilling. And so I take pride in that. Sometimes I don't talk about it. I mean, last January, I was down at the border in La Cruces. I was in Mexico looking at the wall from the other side. And I came back and I started talking about that and raising key questions. And that was my activism around that issue. Okay. The same way people who know me well is, okay, I'm talking to the Hebrew College today. Okay. Last week I was interviewing my friend Anand Amari, who was the founder of the first Arab American Museum in Michigan. And, I was interviewing her because she has a new memoir, a second memoir, The Wandering Palestinian. Now, let me show you about the world we live in, right? So I do this program for the Arab Hour, right? Robbie, early in this show, this program today, read my bio, right? And she, do you think the Arabic Hour mentioned my Fulbright to Israel? Oh, no, they weren't. This is why we have CNN and MSNBC, right? No, this is why we also have Fox News. People will eliminate things that they don't want to have. But this also gets back to my activism. I try to bridge those communities, okay? And that has been what I feel. If as an African-American, I can do cultural programs that when I sit in the audience, I see someone Jewish talking to somebody who might be from Saudi Arabia, then I think I've done my job in helping solve the problems and future problems of the United States. You see, bridging those communities, which puts you at risk, okay? But to show you how I help out, because I had been to Israel, okay, and I document all this. Joy Harjo, who is the Port Lord of the United States, not Amanda Gorman, but Joy Harjo, who's the indigenous, first Native American woman to be Port Lord of the United States for a third term, okay? She came under a lot of criticism because she was going on a trip to Israel. And I came to her defense and said, okay, here are people that once you go, you should meet with. This is it. And then I will make sure when you come back, I will write a thing on your behalf. The reason why these trips are important. Now that puts you at odds with a lot of people in terms of how they view Israel. But at the same time, what happens, I feel as an activist, someone has to do these things. Okay. And, you know, you're laying the foundation for future relationships and stuff. Henry Louis Gates, for example, when he was getting attacked around Black Jews, I was the one writing a piece in the New York Times coming to his defense, and he never forgot that. Now, the first question about, you know, writing this first person, that's an outgrowth of me being around two key writers. One is the poet A.I., who's phenomenal. She always has these like dramatic monologues. She's always can get into characters. You know, she write a poem in the form of the voice of Mike Tyson. You know, I mean, she's always doing these things. She was a real deep influence on me, you know, really different. And the other person was Lee Howard, who's deceased now, but both of them, I and Lee Howard is deceased. But Lee Howard, I heard her on the radio when I was in DC, and she was reading this poem called The Rape of Donna, and it was just phenomenal, you know? And I said, I got to publish this poem. And eventually I would meet Lee Howard maybe months later. We became really good friends. And I remember she was at my apartment, and I had to ask, I said, Lee, where do these stories come from? You know, because they were in the voices. And she said, well, Ethelbert, you know, I come from a long line of storytellers. And this is what I do. And I was like, okay, well, I can't imitate that, but I'm going to try. Because what happened, it was, I never heard storytelling at that level, where all of a sudden like, you're caught into it. You want to know what's going to happen next. And she just had that skill. And all I did as a good student, let me trace that. You know how you get that little, let me trace that. And that's how I began to experiment, stepping outside of myself. If I didn't have the eye, you know, influence, I probably couldn't have written those poems about Central South America, because some of those poems are written in the voice of somebody who's growing up in El Salvador. So it is a risk, you know, it is a risk, you know, and that's the thing where I've seen other people stop trying to take those risks because they feel, okay, what right do I have as a man to write a poem in a woman's voice? What right do I have as a white person to write a poem in a Black voice, okay? Well, if you're not going to take risks, you're not going to be an artist. And if you fail and you still want to do it, get it right. That's all. Just get it right. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Just get it right.
Great, thank you. Let's hear from Hindi and Shani.
Hi, thank you for being here. This has been really incredible to hear your art and holy words, and shout out Rafi for recognizing the importance of translating this work, but even more important for sharing the work and not just, you know, translating and walking away, but bringing it to our communities, and then we can pass it on to communities that might not have even known to pick up the text. So really appreciative of that. Ethelbert, I'm not sure if that's how you want us to refer to you. Okay, cool. You mentioned earlier in the conversation of this kind of caution around word choice. And I'm curious if you can speak a little bit more about that and your process, both from an editing standpoint of there's too many words on the page, yet every word seems wholly and significant and powerful. How do I tone that cut out? And also from the standpoint of how do you get your message across using strong words, with some of that chutzpah in there, harshness in there, but in a way that's actually effective, like you were just saying about taking the risk to be an artist, and what your process is to do that.
Well, you know, if we were,
I just want to also hear from Shani, and then yeah.
I'm looking forward to the answer to that. Thanks so much for being with us. As a person trained to be clergy, and also a person who, like, on the side practices writing, I've been thinking a lot about where those things meet and diverge, and I'm curious in your contact with people of faith or faith traditions and clergy and the work that you're doing and the activism you're doing, where do you see the work of a writer and the work of a clergy person who often also gives sermons, I would say, is like one major form of doing writing as a religious practice? Or where do you see those things, those positions converging or diverging? Where is a clergy person like a writer, and where are those things actually different projects?
Well, I'll go back to my opening comments, and I was reading from the essay that I wrote in the Writer's Chronicle. And there was one thing that I made reference there in the beginning. We are more familiar with Martin Luther King's like speeches and stuff, but not his sermons. And so what happened, I make a reference into it, you know, I use it also like a riff, but it's A Strength to Love. That is a title of a book. That's the title of Martin Luther King's sermons, which is very, very important because, you know, King's rooted in terms of philosophy, and you get a sense of that he's not in front of the Lincoln Memorial. And it's a completely different King that we see there. I think what happens is that, you know, you always want to make sure that your work and your word has an outlet, and it takes different forms, and you have to master all those forms. And that's where, you know, when I look at the writers that I admire people like Langston Hughes, because Langston wrote in every single genre. And then Langston was a very prolific letter writer, but, you know, everything from plays and also doing translations, you know, Langston did those things. So that was always my model. And if you are a politician, or if you or any situation in society, we have to get away from just doing this one thing. You know, you have to be able to say, I'm going to do everything. I think Stacey Abrams writes novels, you know, and you know, you can do that. You know, you're not just limited to, you know, one thing. I'm going to be a bank clerk, you know. So once you take that approach and you are disciplined enough to realize that what you're working on, you want to perfect it. But keep in mind, every form that you write in, you know, whether it's a sermon, whatever, or letters to the editor, require that same dedication, that same commitment to excellence. And it ties back into the first question, is the selection of language, that you're precise, that you are able to know, I'm using this word. This is why poetry is so important, because when you're dealing with the studying of poetry, it moves beyond words. You have to ask yourself, okay, how is this punctuation working? Okay, I tell you what I face as an African-American writer. Give me a little scene. I always remember, I've seen it so many times. It's a summer, and a young woman with like a really short dress gets on the bus, and right there behind the bus driver, in that Rosa Parks seat, is an older Black woman who's sitting like this, right? And as the young girl goes by the old Black woman does this. You see that little look, okay? Now, if you are a writer, how do you capture? Is this a period, comma, semicolon? You got to capture that, you see, because that's a little nuance of how this older Black woman is seeing this young girl with a short skirt. Okay, you know, you got to capture that, and this is why when you go back to literature of the 1930s, when people were into proletarian, you would emphasize the strength of a word or even a sentence in caps. Workers unite, so it jumps out at you like that. And that was a device and technique, but you knew that you wanted to underscore that. Now, getting back to my memoir, okay, Fathering Words, I had to make a decision how I was going to present this duet between me and my sister without using italics. And so what happens if you see the actual book, where my sister's voice it's shaded. Okay, now what I held up, this is the anniversary issue. It's not shaded. The only way you know that it's my sister's voice is that a paragraph begins in italic. You see, but you can see small little things like that. You could read this book. I mean, I was looking at it and I said, okay, why didn't they shade the pages? Well, they began each place where my sister's voice comes in. They use that. This is the same thing when you decide that you're a poet and you practice the economy of words. And this is how I pretty much teach and sometimes give people feedback on the poems. I want to get at the bone. I want to get at the marrow of what you're trying to say. And all of a sudden I'm cutting. Somebody said, well, Ethelbert, you leave me with anything. Good, you have a haiku. Okay. And what happens is that many times writers who begin want to say a lot, especially playwrights. You know, they want to have a cast like 15 actors and stuff like that. And they got everything to say and stuff like that. First people have a lot of stuff to say. And what happens is knowing how to scale back. Remember when Bill Clinton came on the scene? Bill Clinton gave a long speech. Damn, we got to, you can run for president twice? You know? But he had a way of presenting. He had a lot to say. And many times artists have to realize, okay, what's going to be the scale of this? And it is a skill. And this is where the translation comes in, because Rafi and I are having to figure out, okay, what's going to be the balance? We have to make decisions. And every time you sit down to write, paint, or compose music, you're trying to figure out, okay, what's the right note? What's the right word? What's the right color?
I just want to make sure, Hindi, do you feel like you were also answered there?
For the most part, I think I'm also curious as well as to, thank you, Rafi, when it comes to using words that push the boundary. And kind of the like more racier words.
Sure.
And getting your point across.
Well, I think the best poem.
I want us to keep that in mind, but I also want to make sure because we only have 10 more minutes left, a little less actually. So I just want to make sure we get, let's get 2 more questions, and then
Rafi, you know what happens though when you do that?
What
it's
happens?
hard because I'm getting old, it's hard for me to remember the first question.
All right, I'll message you. I'll direct message you. I just want to get Lawrence and Leah in here.
Was Shani, I think maybe.
I think Shani asked got our question answered, but
great. Great. Okay, great. Thank you. So yeah, I imagine that there are parallels between the work that you might have done at Harvey and what we are doing in regards to being students of our own cultural literary tradition and trying to kind of bridge the gap between what has come before and the present moment. And I'm curious, kind of in bridging communities, you mentioned this kind of idea of bridging communities. I guess I'm curious, like what advice you would have for students trying to figure out how to do this work in regards to like how much research is necessary versus just writing in the moment, and kind of what advice you might give to students in that process of figuring that out.
And then Leah, please, for just to round it out.
Yeah, I'm wondering, as it's a weird question, but as white artists, what is it that could be the most helpful in our work to supporting the work of supporting not only Black lives, but Black thriving, right? What is it that you wish white artists would do with our talents to help you most?
Well, I'll begin by saying this, and I made reference to Adrienne Rich earlier. Adrienne Rich edited one year the Best of American Poetry, and what she was surprised at, looking at all this work, is how infrequent white writers wrote about race. That it just wasn't a subject matter in terms of a focus. And so that's, I think, is the real concern. I think we're beginning to see the wake-up call in terms of, okay, this is happening. And it's the same way we're waking up to, oh, this is climate change. And what happens is that if you are white or whatever, you have to be a witness to this, and you have to speak up. As an activist, the people that we really have to, because what we really have to concern about is not white and Black people, but the sun and the moon and the earth and everything. We have to really be concerned about that, because they're like saying, hey, will somebody do something? Like it's like like the polar bears are trying to get somebody to help them out. And so that's it. And what happens, it goes back to what I was saying in the Writer's Chronicle, and I make reference to Baldwin. It's a lover's struggle, okay? And I don't know about you guys, but loving one person is difficult. It's just one person. We ain't talking about loving God. We talking about loving a person that you might be sleeping next to, and I don't really like. He's snoring. And so what happens is that takes a patience and understanding. And so that's what it's not like somebody's going to give you a how to do or what you should do. Okay, I can't tell you how to live your life. I can't tell you like, okay, hold the door for the next Black person that comes through. I can't tell you that, because you might want to slam the door because you're in a bad mood. Okay, and that's not to say there's no problem with that, because that's something that you're wrestling with right now. Now the other person doesn't know that you're in a bad mood. Okay, but there isn't a thing like, okay, I'm gonna read a few books on race and now I got the answer. No. Sometimes it begins in terms of the communal aspect. Many people do not enter the homes of others. Okay, many, they don't do that. They do not sit around the table and tell a person, pass the bread. They don't do that. Okay, now you have Shabbat and think, well, you should be inviting people in. That's good. But sometimes the people that you invite are Jewish. Okay, and so what happens is that's what you can do. But what happened, if you think that you have to do something, then you need to check back how you were raised. Because the first person to tell you what to do and not to do is your parents. Okay, that's why when I was at some of these schools and there'd be protests, I said, I just want to talk to their mothers and fathers. What are they talking around the dinner table? Where did they get these ideas from? Okay, I wasn't raised that way. Okay, I wasn't raised that way, and so no one had to tell me, what to do. If I saw something there where a person was not being kind to another person, I knew I had a responsibility to do that. And what I'm really happy is when I look at my children, how they are raised. I looked at my daughter. I'm walking down the street one time. She broke off from me. She was small, and she gave her little coins to somebody who's homeless. I didn't have to teach her that. That was something that she must observe, when I'm walking down the street. And these are the things that you monitor. Now, getting back to the language, and then Martha, you have to remind me of the second. See, I know the two pieces of bread. I don't know what's in the middle. But the thing about the language is very important. And one of the best poems, and you have to look for it because it doesn't show up in the anthologies because of the language. But it has a lot to do when I was talking about the puppy dying. It's a poem by Carolyn Rogers. And Carolyn Rogers has this poem called The Last MF. And she goes to this whole thing like, men have been saying that, I shouldn't be using this word, love that, and this and that because I'm feminine and I shouldn't be using this word. And she goes through all this thing about MFs until she says, you know what? I'm not going to use the word anymore. But there's a lot of MFs out there. And until they're gone, I'm going to continue to use this word. It's an excellent poem, okay? And you see that's a poem about race. If you look at the language that people who were gay had to wrestle with, to turn around. One time people who were male homosexual took that word faggot and turned it around. Okay. And sometimes what happens, the writers of movements turn that language around because they realize that this is what has been oppressing them. And as they throw off that oppression, sometimes the first place it occurred or has to occur is in the language. The language is oppressive. Okay, we've seen it now within the transgender movement. That the language is oppressive, and so what you have to do is you have to make sure that you're part of that type of artist making those changes. Now, Ravi, help me out. What was the meat in the second question that was in the middle?
Lawrence asked, "What advice do you have to bridge communities?"
Well, I think what happens is not necessarily your art in terms of the bridging. I think it has to do actually with what you're actually doing. Okay, so I know that many times artists are talking about their activism and their art. I focus more on their act. What are you doing when you wake up? Okay, some artists, for example, are not members of organizations; they're individuals. And sometimes what happens, you might need to join an organization to get your direction and guidance. And so that's what I feel that sometimes, you might need to do.
It's right now 3:26. I see we have one more question in the chat. Danielle, do we have time for it? Or should we close out here?
You're putting the pressure on me to make that decision. Yeah, sure, go for it.
I just want to be a little rude. What can I say? Micha, go for it.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. Thanks so much for being here, Ethelbert. I want to ask you about one phrase that I think I heard you say kind of briefly towards the beginning, that which was talking about an era of a third Reconstruction. which is just a new term that I've heard I heard some historians and literary professors talking about at NPR on Erev Shabbos on Friday, to understand this moment, this sort of era, the era of Obama and backlash of new racial reckoning and new kind of flourishing symbolized by a Black president. And as a question along the lines of one of the other areas that it seems like you're doing some work of following some of the way that words are used in our public discourse. And I'm curious about the power you think of there might be in drawing narrative and literary connections between our current era and other eras of racial coming to consciousness as a country around racist structures and trying to envision new.
I think it's an excellent question to end on. One person who's popularized that term quite a bit has been Reverend Barber. And I think that what happens is that if we look at the narrative that especially came out of Georgia, okay, not the one that comes out of January 6th, but the one that comes out of Georgia, that narrative is really important in terms it shows the power of the black vote. It shows the ability to form partnerships in terms of race. All of coming out of John Lewis's office. You see this possibility of people coming together, finding common grounds, especially dealing with some of the economic issues. Okay, that this is a way of going forward. Keep in mind that when we talk about the failure of Reconstruction, it's because of the deals being made behind closed doors. It's also the failure is the fact that we realize, okay, we can't count these votes. You see, there was something very revealing by Donald Trump, when people might forget. You might recall that when Donald Trump was just dealing with, I think Michael Cohen remembers this, when Donald Trump said this thing about he doesn't want Black people to count his money. It's obvious he don't want Black people to count his votes either, and I say that because what happens is that, we're talking about disenfranchisement, but this is voter suppression, not Florida, it's voter suppression. When you begin to look at this, what needs to be as we go ahead, and we don't want to make sure that we have a failed Reconstruction a third time, like in baseball, third strike, that what happens, we have to pay attention to state issues, to gerrymandering, the control of state legislature. That is where the battle is going to be, okay? You keep in mind, people were circling around state houses before they decided to circle or storm the Capitol here in Washington, D.C. But the state problem, state by state, what you might be the dangerous thing is to see a splintering of the Republican Party, and these sort of like old Dixiecrats or Trumpites or whatever take over the Republican Party, and they become the dominant party and win elections, and then all of a sudden we're living through Woodrow Wilson, and I can only go to the Library of Congress if I want to pee. What I'm saying? This is what we're afraid, and this is something that Malcolm X said that was overlooked. He said Malcolm X was always saying, the civil rights thing. No, because what happens? Somebody can come along and just write you out. Can you think of, look at how much Biden has changed in a few days just with this writing. I just find it amazing. I mean, somebody just say, should Black people all be, oh yes, I just signed that. That, like we saw, Muslim ban. You're on a plane, you got a ticket, you get back, got your luggage, we're concerned about what's gonna be on the plane. And then all of a sudden, you ain't on the plane, your luggage gone, but you're back here because somebody decided that, I'll just pass that out. And you see, let me end on this, Reconstruction. If there's one guy that we should be looking for, I know I'm looking for him. If anybody ever gives him a job, I ain't talking Giuliani, I'm talking Stephen Miller. You see, when everybody was leaving the Trump White House, do you ask yourself, who's turning out the lights? Okay, Stephen Miller. And you might recall, wasn't his uncle said this is not the Jewish kid I remember. So he did a page, I think something in the New York Times. And these are the individuals who will present for a reconstruction, the future and the beauty of America from occurring. I don't know where his ideas came from. you know, Bannon or whoever, he was his mentor. But this is what we're confronted with. And when we go back, it's important to read Foner's books because Foner has always been the expert on Reconstruction. It's also important to read W.E.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction because that's key. I end on this. This is what I told my friend Lonnie Bunch, who became the founder of the African American Museum. I said, Lonnie Bunch, I hope this isn't just one thing down here on the mall that we're talking about slavery, because if you want this museum to engage us, as museums should do, just like universities and colleges, then it has to be something that comes in and says, okay, what are the possibilities? And the possibilities are not rooted in slavery. The possibilities are rooted in Reconstruction.
Ethelbert, thank you so much. Really,
Robbie, are you gonna have a closing prayer for us?
I wasn't planning on it, but
well, Robbie, this is what training is all about.
I guess I just would want to then bless all of us with the ability to use our writing for good, and that our writing can be a manifestation of our deepest hopes and our most honest beliefs that we can create this country and this world to be more whole.
And Rafi, in the words of Duke Ellington, we love you madly.
Love you madly, Ethelbert. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming.
Okay, thank you. And I wish everyone safe and be well. Okay, many blessings. Okay, take care.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Yeah.
Is that the guy who punted the thing over you?
Exactly.
Okay, and I'll underscore, if anybody wants to send me email anything, Robbie, just you can share my email with everybody.
I'll send it to them, yeah.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ethelbert. Really
all right. Okay, many blessings.
Thank you all. Really appreciate another full day. What I would have said if Ethelbert was still here is just we hope, I know this session was a little different than the others, and we hope this couple of days is in part inspiring, and to be with somebody who has devoted his life to, through his art, through his activism, through his interactions to healing and building bridges, we hope would be inspiration for all of us. So thank you so much. We'll be back together tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock for Tefillah and one last full day together. Have a great, and Rafi, shkoyach, thank you so much. All right, be well, everybody.
Thank you.